The U.S. government moves away from private prisons as the Obama administration takes another step toward criminal justice reform. Hello, I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Private prisons are a billion-dollar industry in the United States. Federal, state, and local authorities contract with corporations to provide incarceration services, and business is booming. But a recent decision by the U.S. government dealt a blow to the federal private prison system. We begin with this report from CCTV's Jim Spellman.
The United States federal government will phase out the use of privately run, for-profit prisons over the next few years. A memo from the U.S. Justice Department instructs the Federal Bureau of Prisons to no longer renew contracts with private prisons, saying those facilities simply do not provide the same level of correctional services, programs, and resources. They do not save substantially on costs, and they do not maintain the same level of safety and security. As of 2014, about 2.2 million people were incarcerated in the U.S. The coming changes apply to approximately 22,000 inmates residing in 13 privately run facilities in the Federal Bureau of Prisons system. Including state and local jails and prisons, about 130,000 inmates are housed in private institutions. The phase-out of federal private prisons will not affect these facilities. The widespread privatization of state prisons began in the 1980s. In 1997, the federal government began outsourcing incarceration as the number of people in prison skyrocketed.
I can do it cheaper every day per inmate than the state or the parish can do it every day. And for the facilities that have federal contracts, we have proven we can do it cheaper than the federal prisons can.
A 2014 study by Temple University, partially funded by the private prison industry, found that private jails and prisons can operate much cheaper than public prisons, sometimes saving states more than 50%. But a recent Justice Department Inspector General report finds that private prisons incurred more safety and security incidents per capita than comparable Bureau of Prisons institutions. Prisoners say the private prison experience can be vastly different than a public prison.
Private facility, it don't have field work, or a lot of them don't have trade schools. See, but in a state facility, you can take up these trades, or you can go work in the field, you go work on the barn, like there's all different types of jobs, but here jobs are limited.
Prison reform advocates argue private prisons put profits ahead of what's best for the community, prisoners, and correctional officers.
We begin to make criminal justice policies not based on what reduces crime or how do we save taxpayer dollars, but we base criminal justice policy based on what is going to drive the economic engines of the criminal justice system.
And now another federal agency, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is reviewing its use of private prisons to house immigration offenders. That report is due in November and could lead to ICE phasing out its use of those private, for-profit prisons. Jim Spellman, CCTV, Washington.
Joining us now in the studio, Christopher Petrella is a lecturer at Bates College and a researcher on race and criminal justice. Also with me in the studio, Hillary Shelton is the director of the Washington Bureau for the NAACP, America's largest civil rights organization. From Florida, Alex Friedman is the managing editor of Prison Legal News. He served time for armed robbery in both state and private prisons. And Arjun Sethi is an adjunct legal professor at Georgetown University and director of law and policy for the Sikh Coalition. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go to Alex in Florida for our first question. Alex, when we look at what's being described here as prison reform, criminal justice reform announced by the White House, so we've got no more federal private prisons. We have no more prison time for defendants who cannot afford bail. How significant are these reforms?
Well, they're a good start. Anybody who has researched or worked in the criminal justice reform arena for many years knows that there's significant problems that confront a very dysfunctional criminal justice system, where the emphasis tends to be more on criminal and less on justice. So these are certainly nibbling around the edges. As we know, the major criminal justice reform initiatives in Congress has somewhat stalled out, and we're still waiting on systemic reform to come from Congress. But in the meantime, these are certainly welcome developments. They are limited, as you noted. The decision to do away with privatized federal prisons will only affect around 14 facilities housing around 22,000 prisoners, which is a very specific demographic of federal prisoners who are non-citizens primarily, who face deportation after serving their prison time. Bail reform is also, of course, very important for defendants who are awaiting trial. So these are welcome developments, but again, just the start of what is going to be a very long process if we want comprehensive criminal justice reform.
All right, Hillary, what do you think on these reforms? I mean, is this reform process starting at the wrong end? Shouldn't we be looking at the entire criminal justice system that puts so many thousands, millions of people in prison in the first place?
Well, I think we should. I'm not saying bad things about what's going on now. It's a small step, but it's important that we look at those who are incarcerated for no good reasons. And of course, even the impact beyond the time they spend in prison. But you're absolutely right. We need a full criminal justice system reform. Quite frankly, we haven't had anything like that since the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. There have been a number of pieces of legislation that will move us ahead to do a very comprehensive assessment of our criminal justice sentence, from sentencing ranges all the way through to time in prison, and even other alternatives to incarceration are things that should very well be on the table.
Christopher, what is your view? Because when we look at the significance of these reforms, private prisons, as we know, make up a very small percentage of the federal prison system. Just about 22,000 of 193,000 federal prisoners are affected by this. That's about 11%. So is this in some way window dressing? Is it a PR exercise, or is it really significant reform?
I think it's significant. I think the DOJ policy directive is certainly worthy of celebration. I think it's also worthy of deep skepticism, in the sense that it is just the very, very tip of the iceberg. To sort of lend a sort of statistical framework to this, the DOJ's more or less realignment policy, right, moving about 22,000 prisoners from federal contract facilities back to public facilities over the course of the next 4 to 5 years, really accounts for 1% of the entire carceral population throughout the United States. And so what I think is important to remember is, not only is it statistically fairly small, but really this is a realignment policy, not a population reduction policy.
Arjun, would it be fair to say that private prisons can only be profitable if there are prisoners to fill them? Therefore, you know, the motivation to fill these prisons up are not exactly rehabilitation or reform or anything like that. It's to make money.
That's exactly right. I mean, I would start by saying the U.S. is home to 4% of the world's total population and 25% of the world's total prison population. For decades, every social ill in America, homelessness, mental illness, drug addiction, has been met with incarceration. So while this step is important, what we really need to be talking about is decriminalization and reducing prison populations altogether, both from private prisons and public prisons.
Arjun, just staying on that point, is there any evidence to show that the people who run these prisons, who own these prisons, who own the biggest number of shares in them, etc., are lobbying not just the National Congress, but even local assemblies, to enact harsher and harsher laws which carry prison sentences so they can fill these prisons?
Absolutely. There is very strong evidence that the biggest private prison companies in America spend considerable sums every year lobbying states, lobbying the federal government, because they want to make as much money as possible.
Alex, as we mentioned at the outset of the show, you've spent 6 years in prison. You were in a for-profit prison in Tennessee. You also spent time in a state prison. What were those experiences like, and what were the major differences that you saw?
That's actually a very common question. I served a total of 10 years, and 6 of those years were at a privately operated facility in Tennessee run by Corrections Corporation of America, the largest for-profit prison firm in the nation. You know, prison is prison, and when you're in a correctional facility, whether it's public or private, you're still in prison. So in many respects, the experience that I had, and you know, hundreds of thousands of other prisoners have, is not terribly different from being in a public prison. But the things that I noticed specifically, the differences in being in a private prison. One, there was a great emphasis on cost cutting. an enormous emphasis on reducing costs in order to generate profit. And that translated into things such as rationing toilet paper, handing out fewer blankets than in state prisons, understaffing the facility, having constant staff turnover because of the low wages that they would pay their staff, and they couldn't retain staff at the facility. So constantly had guards in the training mode coming in and out of the facility. And also using prisoner labor for security-related issues. And for example, they would have the inmates string the razor wire on the fences. They had inmates design a program in the computer lab to track the failures of the motion detectors on the perimeter fences. They gave me the floor plan of the facility so I could design fire evacuation diagrams for the prison. Now, all these things, when you have inmates do them, it saves money because inmate labor is practically free. But those security-related things, typically you don't want prisoners doing them for obvious reasons. But the focus of the private prison was so much on the bottom line, on making profit. They had a sign out front that would have their daily stock price, which they only removed once the stock started going down. But that was the emphasis, that was the focus. It had nothing to do with public safety or providing a public service for the public good. It rather had to do with private profit.
All right, so Hillary, we have these private prison operators who will tell us that they can do it more cheaply than the state system, in some cases as much as 50% less expensive. But at the same time, as Alex has been pointing out, if safety is sacrificed, if they use fewer guards, for instance, it's not the same. I mean, it's more dangerous, isn't it?
Well, not only is it more dangerous, but you're losing programs if you're thinking about what happens when people come out of prison. What is the purpose of incarceration should probably be the first issue on the table. Well, the purpose is hopefully to actually prepare people to come back into the world. You pay your penance, that is, you spend your time, you pay for the crime you committed, but hopefully when we return you home, you can become a more constructive, contributing member of your communities. That means we need programs in the prisons. We've seen prisons that at one time we provided even an opportunity for higher education. What all the data shows is the higher your level of educational attainment when you come out of prison, the less likely you are to go back in, if that's your intent. If the idea is profit, then quite frankly, you want that revolving door to continue being that revolving door. So we still need to fix that problem.
Chris, you've done a lot of research on the intersection of race and the correction system. What have you found?
Yeah, this is a great seg because it also deals with the profit motive and ways that companies tend to prevent the erosion of their profits. As a researcher, I can tell you that there's not a single non-industry funded study that I've ever seen that I consider to be methodologically transparent and sound that demonstrates unimpeachably that private prisons save money for taxpayers relative to public facilities, if we want to use that sort of language. And so part of my research in the past has dealt with that very distinction. And what I found was that private prison companies like CCA and GEO, but specifically CCA, architects their contracts with these public agencies to prevent them from having to incarcerate the most costly prisoners. That is to say, older and or geriatric and or infirmed prisoners who will erode the bottom line. So whereas public prison companies don't necessarily have the luxury of choosing who they incarcerate, private prison companies do, and therefore makes any cost analysis, or at least cost comparison, very, very difficult.
So that's all driven by a profit motive?
In many respects, yes. Public prisons are also driven by a profit motive in some respects as well, because the way that they're financed through bonding, through bond issues, lease revenue bonds, general obligation bonds, often requires that investment banks bundle, package, and sell, and sometimes buy that debt issuance, which means that even if California builds a public prison, financial services industries and industry companies are still making a lot of money, irrespective of whether or not those beds get filled. If the prison gets built, Goldman Sachs gets a hefty percentage on their investment.
All right. So, Arjun, we have the White House announcing these reforms. It affects only federal private prisons. What about the state system? Is there any movement among states to change that as well?
Very little, and it's disconcerting. The states have been using private prisons for decades. Furthermore, ICE, Immigration Custom Enforcement, also uses private prisons. So the Obama administration is detaining roughly 300,000 immigrants a year, and the majority of them are placed in private prisons as well. So we need to be revisiting the use of private prisons by states, but also by ICE.
Alex, you wanted to say something there?
I wanted to jump in just for a moment.
Yeah.
The slightly rosy side, or the slightly silver lining, is that some states have decided to back off. Kentucky no longer contracts with private prison companies. They used to have 3 private prisons in the state, now they have none, although I believe they're trying to repurpose those facilities. Idaho canceled its contract with CCA after a massive scandal of fraud in an FBI investigation and the company admitting that its employees had falsified staffing records. And CCA no longer has that contract, and so on. So there's, and Texas, believe it or not, which is kind of known as the prison state in the nation, has canceled 2 private prison contracts in the last several years and no longer contracts with CCA for those 2 facilities, although it continues to contract for dozens more. So although, yes, the states are still using private prisons to a large extent, and definitely ICE is still using privatized immigration detention facilities, some states have seen the light, and this predates what the Department of Justice found in the Office of the Inspector General report.
Hillary, I want to look at one of the other reforms that was announced by the White House, and that is poor defendants who cannot afford bail can't be jailed anymore. You know, we've seen and read about the horrendous cases that have been taking place at Rikers Island in New York, that tragic story of a young boy who was incarcerated for 3 years, awaiting trial, 2 of them in solitary confinement. He was released, he subsequently committed suicide. Why is that not a major issue in this country?
Well, I think it is for many of us as we think about the poorest of the poor. For those who have the resources they can put down to hold the places as they go out and come back and actually stand trial and whatnot, was one thing. If you look at most of those who are actually in our prisons today, it's a good indication of who ends up finding themselves on bail as well. And that is, we know that in our prisons, less than half of those are there for nonviolent, mostly drug-related offenses. Not people that are going to actually hurt anyone else, not folks that are a threat to the local communities and otherwise, but those that have made the mistake of utilizing drugs, perhaps being addicted to drugs and other issues along those lines. So we think about people actually having to spend time in jail simply because their pocketbooks won't allow them to go free. It raises major concerns. We were delighted to see some of the things that have happened in places like New Jersey and a few other places across the country, and we're hoping to see more bail reform as we move throughout.
Christopher?
Yeah, I think that's right. It also strikes me as important to think about the ways in which class and socioeconomic status serve as sorting mechanisms for those who find themselves caught in sort of the nettle of the criminal justice system. Loic Wacant, who's a researcher at UC Berkeley, published a piece in 2009-2010 finding that around that time, I believe it was during 2009, out of everyone who went to prison that year, at the time of their arrest, 50%, a full 50%, were living at or below half of the federal poverty line, which is around $6,500 a year. It's important to remember the way in which that serves as a mechanism for sorting.
Arjun, there was a report issued in Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in on the tail end of Chris's comments. You know, in Prison Legal News, we published on this previously, which is there's really a dual system of justice in the United States. There's one for the wealthy and the connected and people who have means and power, and then there's one for everybody else. And the way we like to put it is you get as much justice as you can afford.
That's right.
And bail is the epitome of that, because if you have money, you can make bail and you will not be in jail. But if you are poor, you cannot make bail, you stay in jail. And it's as simple and as clear-cut as that. And that is only one small illustration of how our justice system works when it comes to wealth and socioeconomic status and power. So yes, bail reform is most definitely necessary and will significantly unclog a lot of our backed-up court system and overcrowded jail systems if people don't have to spend time in jail while they're awaiting trial and presumed innocent simply because they're poor.
Arjun, you're the attorney here. You know, what Alex is talking about, the way people are treated differently, this twin-track system of justice that we have, is that not a violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Look, there's no question, to revisit this issue on class, people who are poor are more acutely impacted by mass incarceration. So are people who are of minority descent, in particular African Americans. African Americans are more likely to be stopped, arrested, prosecuted, and receive lengthier sentences. That does raise interesting constitutional questions, specifically due process at each step of the stage. So, for example, when you look at something like stop and frisk in New York, we saw that African Americans were being acutely impacted by this policy that was supposedly facially neutral, and a judge found that the policy disproportionately impacted African Americans and violated the reasonable suspicion standard of the Constitution. So we are making incremental progress on some of these issues, but not enough. Even if you look at something like right to counsel, the right to counsel is supposed to be applicable to everyone, but we've always found that African Americans and poor criminal defendants are unable often to afford counsel. And as a consequence, they're more likely to plead guilty, not get bail, and languish in our prisons.
All right, and what about violation of human rights? There was a Human Rights Watch report, which was produced in 2014, which expressed concerns about human rights in the United States. So how does human rights fit in with the criminal justice system?
Thank you for raising that. It's my belief that the U.S. criminal justice system is a human rights catastrophe. Every step of the stage, in terms of people being stopped, people being prosecuted, the length of the sentences, things like solitary confinement. So we've just found that really every facet of the criminal justice system implicates different human rights norms, including the prohibition against solitary confinement, including guarantees of due process, fair trial, equal protection, measures like that.
Well, let's add the utilization of the death penalty to that
Absolutely.
matter as well.
Absolutely.
We're still a country that executes both at the state level as well as at the federal level.
Christopher, Arjun made that point earlier on that the United States has the highest prison population in the world, most of them being people of color. A lot of people ended up in prison over the last 20 or 30 years because of the so-called war on drugs. So a lot of, especially young black people, ended up in prison. And there are some people, like the movie maker Michael Moore, who says that this was actually a very devious way of disenfranchising black people, that, you know, their vote was taken away because they now have a felony conviction, so they lost the vote, and in many instances that changed the political picture in many, many states. Does he have a point there?
He does have a point. I think from a theoretical perspective, policies, just because policies perhaps are unintentional, it doesn't mean they're accidental. Right. I think that's an important point to underscore, right? And whereas I would argue that certainly laws that are architected, as Arjun said, as sort of facially race neutral, certainly have a disparate impact on communities of color in every stage of the criminal processing system, whether that's life conditions, whether that's surveillance and policing, whether that is interrogation. There are a whole host of studies that now suggest that one's race, at least in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was a major factor in whether or not pretrial interrogations were taped. What does that say about the equal application of justice?
Well, if I can even add, if we look at the utilization of things like disenfranchisement of felony offenders, in certain states that first began using that were states that were trying to disenfranchise African Americans very specifically. There were states like Mississippi at the time that had an African American population that was 45% during those years. Yet African Americans could not get elected into statewide or federal positions coming to Congress or the like. They utilized tools like our criminal justice system and even crafted the kind of offenses that you would very well be brought up on and to have your right to vote taken away from you altogether and never returned. Even if we look at how that works today, we have about 6 million Americans that cannot vote because they have felony offenses on their record. If you look at the kind of offenses they are, what you see again is that there's that disparate impact as it affects African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color in the country. So it raises major concerns, not only in incarceration, but also the effect of being prosecuted and found guilty of a crime, even as you try to come back out and become a constructive, contributing member of society.
You know, Hillary, there's a great quote from Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, in which she says, like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race.
Absolutely true. As a matter of fact, it's amazing that she was able to take so many decades of experiences in the criminal justice system and make it very clear for today. There's no question about those issues. Or even how, even as people are being incarcerated, forms of slavery are actually utilized in prisons in which corporations are able to go in, contract with the prison, get their work done very, very cheaply. And those prisons are getting very little to nothing. They come out with very little to nothing and find themselves in that spiral of going back again. So the point she's making is absolutely right on target. If we think about disenfranchisement and other forms of capital, whether it's political capital or economic capital, all those things come into play.
Alex, when it comes to serving time in prison, you know, as Hillary pointed out earlier on, it's supposedly about rehabilitation, about training people who go to prison so that they can come out and contribute usefully to society. Was that your experience, or is it just about punishment?
Oh, that's simply a myth that hasn't existed since the 1970s at best. So prison has nothing to do with rehabilitation. If we wanted to design a system to basically ensure that people who go to prison come out and are more likely to commit crimes, then that is the system that we have. We've done a great job at it. So when people are incarcerated, they're stripped of all responsibility. They're completely controlled. They're often humiliated, subjected to abuse in many different ways. There are underlying issues that led to their incarceration, which typically are alcohol or drug abuse or mental health issues, since our prisons and jails are de facto mental health facilities in this country. Those issues do not get addressed while they're incarcerated. Then they are released with a felony record that makes it almost impossible for them to find a job that provides a living wage. And with a felony record also makes it difficult for them to find a stable residence and place to stay. They receive virtually no rehabilitative services while they're incarcerated, and for some reason we are astounded that we have a recidivism rate up to 67% or so. Frankly, I'm surprised it's not enormously higher, given that we have designed a system that is instructional in terms of ensuring that people fail once they get out of prison.
20 seconds I have. What is President Obama's, what legacy does he leave on reforming criminal justice?
I think President Obama has touched the tip of the iceberg here in a powerfully material and symbolic way. I think the rate of clemency that he's granted recently is something that that's been just unprecedented.
Okay. We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Thank you for being with us. That was a really good show.